You are live. Everybody, it's Melissa Simmons.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Thank you all for being here. My name is Melissa Simmons, and I am here representing Florida Freedom Keepers. So I'm just going to let some people log on. So we're going to start here shortly, and I'm just so thankful that you can give up your time tonight. Today is going to be an exceptional educational event. We'd also like to know where you're from. Tonight's call is a national event, so please post where you're from. We're hoping to get a lot of national awareness. And so while you guys are still filtering in, I'll tell you a little bit about Florida Freedom Keepers. And I also want to talk about Freedom Keepers United, which is our international organization. So come on in, sit a while, hang out with us. Welcome to tonight's event, which is dedicated to growing knowledge about state forced vaccine laws in the U.S. About 2 weeks ago, we did an event on Florida's forced vaccine laws. We can post a link to that and you can rewatch that. And that was a really great event with the same amazing lawyers that we have tonight. And then today we'll be looking at laws throughout the U.S. If we are going to address these issues, we'll have to grow national awareness. So we think that's really important. So for those that are just joining us, go ahead and write where you're from. Florida Freedom Keepers is a grassroots civil liberties organization. We were founded about 10 months ago. I am one of the executive board members, and I am very passionate about medical freedom. I'm very passionate about education. Our tagline is Unite, Educate, and Empower. And we really believe that activism can start at any level. Just you being on this call is a form of activism. You showing up to events is a form of activism, reaching out to politicians and just raising awareness for things that are happening in your state. Each state is different, so not every state is going to look the same. And that's why tonight is really special. If you would like more information about Florida Freedom Keepers, you can find us online at flfreedomkeepers.org, and I'll try to post the link in the comments. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Freedom Keepers United. I know that I have some fellow chapters that are on tonight, and I just am so honored that you guys can be here. Florida Freedom Keepers is a state chapter, and we have over 40 other state chapters in the U.S. We have over 7 countries included. So Freedom Keepers United is actually an international organization which started in California. And I'm not sure if Allison is going to be on the call tonight, but I just want to thank Allison and the girls in California for all the hard work that they do in establishing Freedom Keepers United. So for those of you that are part of the Freedom Keepers United state chapters, you can post where you're from and what state you're from. And if you would like more information about Freedom Keepers United, you can just go to freedomkeepersunited.org and you can find more information. We have state chapters all over, and Instagram is the easiest way to find if your state has a Freedom Keepers chapter, and you can join the social media and you can find ways to raise activist work. I just want to say it is such an honor to work with these lawyers. They work tirelessly to bring you the most accurate information. They comb through these laws. I could never do it. They show like what the bills say, and I'm like, what? I can't even read that. So we all have our special talents, and we welcome you to join us in activism work because we really believe in medical freedom and civil individual liberties. So we are honored and pleased to have an amazing panel of attorneys speaking tonight. They are some of the only attorneys in Florida that have spent significant time looking at the forced vaccine laws. So like I said, a couple weeks ago, we did Florida, and now we're going to do national. And I would just like to tell you a little bit about the lawyers that will be speaking tonight. I'd like to talk about Sean. He is absolutely incredible. He is spearheading this effort. Our Sean McBride, and you can find him on social media as well. is a corporate lawyer licensed in 13 U.S. states and Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of the University of Maryland School of Law, where he graduated with honors. He spent approximately 10 years in big law, practicing at some of the largest firms in the United States before starting his own law firm in 2012. He is dedicated to helping business owners with their issues related to ownership and control of their business, particularly with respect to capital raise, partnership agreements, and mergers. He is a strong advocate for personal freedom and liberty. He has researched Florida law, U.S. Supreme Court decisions, and national trends on personal liberty, particularly with respects to mandatory vaccinations. And I see this firsthand with Sean. He is extremely passionate. I'm just going to make a side note. I have an amazing co-host behind me. I'm a single mom, and I do this in my spare time. I volunteer my time for free. And my son loves to join me on these calls. Mom. This is my co-host, Liam. I'm hungry. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sophia Dean. I'm hungry. Okay, cool. Give me a second. I'm going to feed him after I introduce Sophia. Liam, can you say hi to everyone? Hi. Sophia Dean, who is a mother as well. She's exceptional and intelligent. Can you give me just a minute? Sophia Dean has been a practicing attorney in Florida for almost 9 years. She believes medical freedom is an important part of our constitutional right. Here, have this. And then I'm going to end with Lewis, because I apologize I'm getting interrupted, because this call is very important. Lewis F. Leo the Fourth is a trial attorney, general practitioner in Broward and Palm Beach, and founder of Florida Civil Rights Coalition, PLLC, which specializes in civil rights defense, in addition to People Over Politics, an independent, nonpartisan social media network dedicated to truth-seeking and grassroots activism. I have had the honor and pleasure of working with Lewis. We've attended events together. I've had the pleasure of interviewing him as well, and he's brilliant. So you guys are in for a great treat. We are doing a Q&A at the end, so don't forget to write your questions, and I will be able to host the Q&A at the end. And I'd love to turn the time over to these incredible lawyers so we can have a great discussion. All right, go ahead and take it from me, Sean.
Fantastic. So I'm popping up everybody on the screen so you can see Lewis and Sophia. I know, guys, we did, for those of you that were able to attend, we did a presentation approximately 2 weeks ago about Florida's forced vaccine laws, and we got a lot of great comments for Lewis and Sophia. They're each going to be doing a piece here in just a few minutes to kind of get us familiar with what's going on with the forced vaccine laws. And Lewis is litigating the mask laws, and I know there's a lot of interest in that right now and a lot of parallels to what we're seeing in forced vaccines. So it'll be very good to see what he's got going on there. Let me pop myself up on the screen here. What we're focused on tonight is our state law research project. We've been blessed to get a number of volunteers helping us, and what we wanted to do is raise awareness about the fact that there are forced vaccine laws in a variety of states. Florida was, the 3 lawyers you're going to see tonight were all Florida lawyers, and we became familiar with Florida's forced vaccine laws. But then as we continued our research, what we started seeing is other states had forced vaccine laws, and these are very rarely discussed. These are out there. They're on the books. They are ready to be used. There's a pandemic planning group of judges that have been working on kind of writing pandemic bench guides, they call them, that talk about what you do in a pandemic. So there's been a lot of planning around the possibility of forced vaccines and a lot of analysis around it, but not a lot of public discussion. And that's one of our real goals, is to bring this awareness to everybody. The idea that, hey, these laws exist. Do you know these laws exist? And is it something you're happy with or not, right? Are you happy that your state potentially could take and force you to take a vaccine? And love this, speaking of YouTube with comments, whether you're live or on video, drop us your comment about what you think about the possibility of, your state forcing you to take a vaccine. We're going to survey the laws that we've seen in a variety of states today to get more people familiar and really hopefully start planting seeds of awareness beyond just Florida, where we've started this. We want more people in the world to know that these laws do exist and they could potentially be used, particularly with this COVID COVID-19 vaccine, which is in a rush phase of development. I was doing a lot of reading about it earlier today, just the fact that they're multi-tracking these developments of these vaccines, and they're moving very, very fast. So the possibility of the vaccines being available at some time in possibly 2021 seems to be very real. And then you pair it with a forced vaccine law, and we may be in a situation where states are actually using some of these laws that are on the books. Some states don't have the laws yet, New York State being a prime example, but New York State is probably one of the most eye-opening because they have a group of their New York State Bar Association in the health law section have actually been putting together a position paper about forced vaccines. They've been examining the U.S. Supreme Court precedent, and they have taken the position that every person in the United States should be given a vaccine as soon as it's available, regardless of religious exemptions or medical exemptions. They want everybody to take the vaccine. So the New York State Bar Association has come out very strongly on this. They are reviewing it, and they're actually talking about taking that very suggestion to the New York State legislature and suggesting to the New York State legislature that they should enact these laws. So I see some questions rolling in live. Keep those questions coming because we do have a Q&A session coming, and to the extent the speakers can, we'll address them as best we can throughout the live event if they're relevant to the topic we're talking on at the time. Our goal at the end of all this is really just to help you, the viewer, understand better what these laws are, be aware of if there's a law in your state, kind of teach you where to go to look it up because we haven't had a chance to research everything. We have an amazing team of volunteers that have been working with us, that have been, digging through different guides, digging through the state laws, digging through articles, digging through pandemic bench guides, and figuring out what these laws are. We haven't had a chance to get into all the laws. So, and this, of course, is grounded in the U.S. Constitution. Sophia will be talking some about that, and I know Lewis will probably talk about that during his segment. Unfortunately, we're not sure that we can fall back on the court system and expect it to protect us. There's been some unfortunate decisions in the court system in the past, which makes it somewhat unpredictable whether a court would protect people under the Constitution. And we're of the mind the safest route is to get these laws amended and get them changed if that's what the public sentiment is, because going to the court and saying, I don't want to take a shot, I think it's unconstitutional, may or may not work out well because there is, again, some unfortunate decisions out there and a lot of people that are pushing for the possibility of forced vaccines. So universal disclaimer, of course, is we're not giving specific legal advice to people. We're lawyers. We're required to kind of say that type of thing. So don't act or refrain from acting based on anything we see tonight. If there's something that's concerning you, go talk to your lawyer, particularly in your state, since we're not licensed in every state in the U.S. We're going to be talking a little bit about what's happening throughout there. Obviously, a lot's happening with this forced vaccines. We're seeing activity in the mask laws. Lewis will be talking about that. A lot of states are mandating masks. A lot of issues with that, obviously, on suspect science, changing recommendations of Dr. Fauci and the CDC. I keep pointing out to people that, back in March, we were told that wearing masks was dangerous for the wearer and it would give you a higher likelihood of contracting COVID. And I don't see any discussion of that now, right? That was science back in March, just 4 months ago, 4 months ago. It was settled science that it was dangerous to wear a mask. And now suddenly they're telling everybody to wear a mask, forcing people to wear a mask. And I have not seen any history of that really being researched, right? So there's issues with that. Meanwhile, in the airports, we're seeing people, there's been a compact of the major airlines, and they've agreed that they're going to ask people health questions as they board the plane and see whether they have COVID, whether they have symptoms, make them sign that they're going to wear a mask on the plane. So that's concerning. That's concerning because that kind of concentrated effort, when we get to the days of a vaccine coming, I can easily see them just changing this questionnaire that the major airlines are using and going in and saying, do you have your COVID vaccine, right? And there's a lot of talk. I've heard some airline folks saying they think that the airlines eventually are going to require people to have the vaccine to fly. So some of the precedents getting set now may be very troubling down the line as this vaccine comes online and becomes available. Meanwhile, up in the upper Midwest, Michigan and Indiana, and I think we did have some people tuning in from Michigan. I saw at least one name fly past saying they're from Michigan. There's been a lot of talk about mandated microchips in Michigan. Indiana as well has been considering legislation on microchips. Microchips, are concerning because once you get the microchip installed, whether it's for your employer or through the government, and the Michigan law that's being considered was actually branded as an anti-microchipping law, but a lawyer up in Michigan carefully tore it apart and found that there were a lot of pro-microchipping provisions in there. So we're going to have to be very careful about the titles of these laws. You actually have to read them. And so when we start getting precedent where states may support people getting microchips implanted in them, then obviously it becomes an easy step to put your vaccine status, whether you've been vaccinated or not, onto that microchip, and you can get scanned as you're getting on and off of a plane or going to a recreational site or wherever. So very concerning precedents are coming through, which are all connected to the forced vaccine, right? Because one step of it is saying, hey, we can force you as a state to take a vaccine, and we'll be examining that in detail in just shortly. But the second piece of that is if there's these other legal developments happening in these state legislatures, they can make it very easy to force the vaccine or check the vaccine status of people. So these things are working as a concert of activity to potentially really make a difficult living situation for people who are concerned about the vaccine or don't want to take the vaccines. So these fights are very relevant to what we're talking about here with the forced vaccines, because all of these other things can play together. And the mask fight, of course, that Lewis is talking about, is the front lines right now. That is the hot topic of the day. That is the thing where the attention is right now. And that battlefield is going to have important implications on what we can do with forced vaccines down the line. We are getting more and more galvanized in this effort. It's a relatively recent effort. Sophia Dean, who will be taking over in just a few minutes, and I started seeing stuff around some weird court orders and this forced vaccine law here in Florida just a few short months ago. It really started bubbling to the surface. Her and I jumped into this, started doing some research. Then we started letting people know, and really the seeds of awareness have been expanding greatly. And I'm happy so many of you can join us tonight for this show live. And I know you'll be telling your friends, and they'll be joining us by recording. And we really are working hard to plant that seeds of awareness. It's a volunteer activity right now. We're collecting names and email addresses. So really welcome anybody who's interested in volunteering to reach out to us. Florida Freedom Keepers has a form you can fill out, basic information, get in touch with us. You can help us to continue to spread the awareness. And we're going to eventually look at potentially turning this into a nonprofit. We're looking at those stages right now about potentially building a full-on nonprofit organization to spread awareness about this and take it beyond that. So, and as a side note, mark your calendars for July 21st, again at 8 p.m. Eastern. We are arranging a town hall. We're going to have some politicians that are either in office or running for office join us. We're going to take their temperature, pun not intended, but we're going to take their temperature on forced vaccines and really see where they stand and talk to them about building the grassroots advocacy to potentially amend or remove these laws in different locations so that we can really start building that momentum to potentially get these problematic issues off there. So I'm going to now toss it to Sophia. She's going to kind of give us some of the background of the legal framework that underlies this system and its laws. Then Lewis is going to give us a mask update, and then we're going to jump into some of these state laws. So Sophia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I see so many different states on there, so it's great to see everyone. While we're not going to touch on a ton of states, we hope to get you at least a pretty broad overview of some stuff that we have seen and give you some encouragement to start looking into your own state. But before we get into that, what I want to talk about is kind of the framework. You see us 2 weeks ago, just as a brief recap, we talked underlying issue with where these laws came from. So there's a 1905 case called Jacobson. If you Google it, it will come right up, 1905 Jacobson case. It's a constitutional law issue that was brought to the Supreme Court decision. And we keep seeing this case pop up in the pandemic bench guides that Sean mentioned. So in that, very briefly, that law or that case resulted in the court saying this is not a court issue, it's a legislative issue, and they're sending it back to the courts to decide. So that means it's going back to the state level for the courts to make for the legislature to rule, to write statutes on how they view forced vaccination and how they deal with outbreaks. The 1905 case dealt with smallpox and mandatory vaccinations for smallpox. And the court said, well, you need to deal with, is it them taking the vaccine that's the most least restrictive, or is there other ways? And ultimately, we're going to leave that up to the state. We see this 1905 case referenced several times in the pandemic bench guides. The pandemic bench guides are kind of a format or instructions for the judges on how to deal with pandemic issues. And that's what is concerning to us. So it's going to go back to your state. So that brings us to, okay, where are our state laws? If the federal government's going to kick this issue to the states, now we need to take a look at each state and how do we get those issues changed. Now we know, I'm sure many of you know, if you don't, the vaccine manufacturers are not liable for injuries that occur with their products. And that's due to a 1986 Vaccine Injury Act that was passed by Ronald Reagan. We have a lot of talk about that in not only the legal community, but in the freedom of choice community, because where there is risk, there must be choice. And mainly there's no one to hold liable. If you take a look at the, let me get my paperwork here. It's the HRSA, Health Resources Service Administration. We have some data and statistics. You can go on there to take a look at how much the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program has paid out. So part of the 1986 Act established the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which allowed individuals to file a petition for compensation. It's essentially a no-fault. It's not like a court. It's a no-fault. There's no discovery done. You basically have to meet some requirements, and there's a statute of limitations. One of the things I want to bring up with that is that approximately 70% of all the compensation awarded has come by a settlement. So they haven't really concluded that there was, based on the evidence, that the vaccines caused any injury. That's actually on page 1. Based on review of the evidence, the alleged vaccines caused the injury. So they just come up with a settlement. It wasn't tried. Nobody made a determination. Also, along those lines, based on the info available at the National Vaccine Information Center, nvic.org, if you haven't checked out that website, that has some great information on it. We're only estimating that between 1 to 10% of all vaccine-related health problems are ever reported to VAERS. And VAERS is separate than the Vaccine Compensation Program. VAERS is the adverse reporting system. That's where any vaccine reactions can be reported by a doctor, a patient, a parent. So it makes us wonder if we're only reporting 1 to 10% of all vaccine-related problems, injuries, and if that 1986 Act hadn't been there, where would this number be with how many people are being paid out? Right now, we're up to $4.3 billion in payouts from this program. And that's something we'd like to keep in mind when we're discussing forced vaccines, because if there is not a way to recoup damages, obviously for attorneys, that's one of the number one things we keep on our mind. How are we going to compensate our client for their damages? There isn't one in vaccines. I think we know that. A lot of people ask about exemptions, okay? School exemptions. The set of laws that we are discussing tonight is not the same as the vaccine exemptions for schooling. This is a different category. They are different statutes. They fall under the guise of public health and public safety. Some of in different states do provide religious personal belief exemptions, but generally speaking, these are two separate subfacts of statutes. So keep that in mind. I know a lot of people are asking, what about religious and medical exemptions? Some of these statutes don't have anything written, especially Florida doesn't have anything written about religious or personal exemptions or medical exemptions. There's nothing there. It's just a very vague law. So please keep that in mind as we move through. I think Lewis is going to do a mask update, and then we're going to get into the state laws.
All right, fantastic. Leo, if you just want to jump in, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sophia. Thanks, Sean. Can you hear me all right?
You sounded great.
Awesome. So just to touch on the vaccine issue, which is very connected to the mask issue, I think we all can agree that these are being forced upon people now, and these are medical devices under federal law, and they require warning labels for that reason, because they have they have risks and can cause serious harm, even death. We've seen cases of children dying while wearing a mask and exercising. We've seen people crash their cars and from passing out wearing these masks. So it's really connected. I think people need to take a look at what's happening with the mask, because it's really a precursor to the coming mandatory vaccine push, which is really what they're talking about. I've sat in on the county commissioners meetings, and they're talking about the vaccine, and they're saying there's not going to be the old normal. There won't be a new normal until there's a vaccine. So I think people really need to pay attention to what they're doing when it comes to the mask requirements, because it's really out of control. And what they're doing is unconstitutional, which is why many cities, many counties now are challenging the mask mandates. We're suing the county of Palm Beach for its mandate, which we advocated against, and went to multiple meetings trying to convince the local officials not to pass the mandate. And they, of course, didn't listen. They didn't listen to the majority of speakers who were at the meeting right before they passed the mandate unilaterally. And despite the fact that doctors, many concerned professionals from all walks were concerned about the safety of these products. So if you would like to take a look at our lawsuit, you can go to floridacivil-rights.org. You can look at the pleadings, the complaint. You can look at the motion for emergency relief, and this can be replicated. In fact, there's been lawsuits filed in many counties in Florida. They've been filed in other states as well, challenging not just the mask mandates, but different emergency orders, which are essentially without authority. I mean, we've seen many unlawful orders now. We've seen closures of public beaches. We've seen lockdowns involving closing businesses, and it doesn't seem to have any real public health benefit, especially when you're putting people out of business and forcing them to suffocate themselves and restrict their oxygen. So I think it's important that we work together to make sure that we're challenging this at every level. And it starts with your local city council or your county board of commissioners. You have to get involved at every level to stop this. And I really am appreciative of everyone who's putting this together, working with other attorneys, Sean, Sophia, the Florida Freedom Keepers. I really am happy to be a part of this. And of course, I'm here to help in any way I can.
Perfect, Lewis. Yeah, I think it's great. Why don't you just talk a little bit about the fight you've taken to Palm Beach? I mean, you've got, and one thing I think we talked a lot in the last video, if people want to go back and reference it, is we talked about the difference between the state constitution and the federal constitution. There's two layers there, and folks need to be aware that they are different. They apply equal. They give double protection basically. If you can find protection under a federal constitution, you're good. If you can find protection under a state constitution, you're good. You get the better of the two, basically for these fundamental rights. I think a lot of your arguments, Lewis, have been grounded in the Florida Constitution and what's happening specifically with particular Florida rules. So maybe you want to go into that a little bit so folks are familiar.
Yeah, and just so you understand, we filed this suit in state court. We're challenging the mandate in Palm Beach County under Florida constitutional law, which has its own framework, and you can go to the Florida Constitution online and look at that. I think everyone from other states should look at their state. I'm only licensed in Florida, so I can only speak to Florida law. I think if you look at your constitution, you will see that, like Florida, many other states have enumerated far more rights, or at least explained them and clarified those rights under your state constitution. For example, in Florida, the freedom of speech comes from Article 1, Section 4. So it's not the First Amendment; it's the fourth of Article 1 of the Constitution. So it's the fourth section. So, we challenged the Palm Beach County mandate under Article 1, Section 2, basic rights, Article 1, Section 4, freedom of speech, Article 1, Section 9, due process, and Article 1, Section 23, which is the right of privacy. And that includes the right to bodily autonomy and to choose and refuse medical treatment. So, again, if you think of the mask as a medical treatment, because it is, you have the right to choose whether or not you want to do this treatment. And so the county can't play doctor and force you to wear a mask, much like the county or the state cannot play doctor and force you to vaccinate. So it's, like I said, it's connected. And in our case, I think you're going to see here, we're seeking emergency injunctive relief. We'll have a decision hopefully within the next few weeks. The court has required the county to respond to the emergency motion. So the court is treating it as an emergency. And after the county has responded, the court will have a hearing and we'll have a chance to argue our position.
Yeah, wonderful. So, I think we're definitely keeping an eye on it and what Lewis is doing. I mean, he's put together some great briefs, very, very long and detailed documents that work through those legal prongs and those legal tests. The problem is, you get uncertain when you get into a legal system. And we talked a lot about that 2 weeks ago in that video is, we just don't know what judges are going to do. And particularly when I think Sophia pointed out, you've got Jacobson from 1905. You've got a lot of law review journals have picked up Jacobson. And, of course, we believe they've taken the wrong side of Jacobson, saying that, that people can force vaccines. Jacobson, of course, as Lewis so eloquently pointed out last time, was written by a slaveholder with notions of this involuntary servitude built into it, right? You're forcing somebody to take a vaccine for the benefit of other people and not worried about the risks or costs or potential damage that you're doing to the person taking the vaccine. It really has kind of the same notions of involuntary servitude that our country has struggled with for such a long time. And that slaveholding Supreme Court justice that wrote the opinion upheld that. So, there's problems with Jacobson that people don't look at. Also, Jacobson is, 115 years old now. The Supreme Court has updated its reasoning in fundamental right cases. So there's probably some layers of additional analysis that would be layered on top of Jacobson if a case was held now. But Jacobson sits there on the books. The Supreme Court hasn't directly said that it's overruled or overturned or no longer good law. A lot of, scholars are referencing it. A lot of public health departments are referencing it. And the pandemic bench guides are referencing it. So part of the problem is, how far up in the court system do you have to go before you potentially win? Because the trial courts are going to look at, what the pandemic bench guides say. They're going to look at what the Supreme Court said 115 years ago. And even though we feel like some of the fundamental opinions and some of the issues that may be wrongly presented, and Jacobson has some distinguishing facts from these current laws, I at least personally think that there's a risk that the court system's not going to think enough and not do a full analysis. So if you're thinking about a safer way to protect the public, the best way is to get these laws updated to where you take this power away from the state to do these actions in a pandemic. So, Lewis, maybe you want to talk just a minute or two more about kind of the risk of the court system and some of the uncertainty.
Sure. And I'd like to comment on the bench guides, because that was one of the things I found early on in my research when I was trying to wrap my head around, what was going on when this pandemic struck. And Jacobson is front and center, throughout these guides, not just in Florida, but other states. And when you look at Jacobson, and you actually understand the facts and how he only had to pay $5, he wasn't held down and a needle was plunged into his arm. It becomes really concerning when you start looking at the bench guide and seeing how it's worded. It is within the power of the state to require mandatory vaccinations. Well, it's not really true. And in fact, Jacobson, he wasn't forced vaccinated. So, it's important. I think the court understands that. And anyone who's faced with a challenge in court, in briefing, for example, against either a motion to dismiss or an effort by a county or state official to cite to Jacobson, it's important that either a litigant or a party who's challenging these mandates actually distinguishes Jacobson. And there's plenty of cases. I'll be happy to email anyone who asks for them. If there's any attorneys who are involved in litigation who would like some help on this, I can send you cases where Jacobson was not only distinguished, but the Constitution was upheld. And there's been cases where emergency orders were enjoined, despite the fact you had officials who were using Jacobson to argue against your constitutional right to refuse that medical treatment. So,
yeah, so it's out there, and you're right, Lewis, and you've sent me some great references, and there are wins against Jacobson, but the problem is the core case has still not been overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, and until the day and the time that somebody takes the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is a challenging,
may never happen.
May never happen, right? So,
right. Yeah,
we talk about, in the U.S., you always hear this, particularly as a kid, like you could take it all the way to the Supreme Court. If your rights are violated, go to the Supreme Court. Well, you've got to go through a bunch of procedural steps. And then ultimately the Supreme Court determines which cases they hear or which ones they don't. So even if you have a case that works all the way through potentially state court systems, and then gets to where it might be reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court, they could just say, no, we're not looking at your case, right? So there's no certainty that we're ever going to get a day where the U.S. Supreme Court is going to revisit Jacobson and give us an update. So a lot of uncertainty going in the court system. That's why.
And you can repeal Jacobson legislatively, essentially. So
that's what we're talking about, right? So the idea is, we don't know whether these laws are constitutional or not. There's a real challenge to them. Of course, Lewis makes very good arguments that they're unconstitutional that we, fundamentally agree with. The problem is you've got people that are working for the state that are going to make the contrary arguments. They're going to muddy the waters and try to say Jacobson is good constitutional law. So we don't know what a court system is going to do. The most certain way, if you're concerned about these laws that we're going to talk about tonight, go to your state and get them pulled off the books. That way you don't have to worry about what the court's going to do. It's as Lewis says, it's a legislative repeal of Jacobson, right? If the Supreme Court already said in 1905 that the power to force vaccinate is with your state legislature, well, if your state legislature doesn't use that power, then you have the potential of eliminating the issue. We will be talking about specific state laws tonight. And as Lewis points out, we're Florida lawyers. We are focused on this, but what we've done is do a survey. We've gone out and looked at the pandemic bench guides. We've looked at the statutes for awareness purposes. And we want to draw everybody's attention to these types of state laws that are out there, just so so that you can plant the seeds of awareness. We welcome, as if you're advocating in a particular state, reach out to us, because we want to share information and share advocacy across state lines and across boundaries. And if there's, lawyers in your local community that want to start a charge, have them reach out to us, because we want to coordinate the team. We want to build something here that's bigger than any of us. So we're going to be getting you, our audience members, very familiar with these state laws, the types of things we're seeing, so you know what to look for. We're going to point out some of them and what we've already read and seen. We're also kind of going to give you an idea of what to look for so you can find them. And my team has been working super hard. I've got a bunch of volunteers that have jumped up since the last call. People just raised their hand and said, hey, can we help? And they've been out looking at these things, and we've been searching for them. These laws are not regularly referenced. There's a lot of talk about childhood vaccines. You can find a lot of articles about childhood vaccines. You can find a lot of debates about it. These adult vaccine laws have been quietly put on the books in a bunch of states, and they're rarely referenced. One of the ways we've been finding them is through these pandemic bench guides. We've been literally Googling and searching state by state, looking for their pandemic bench guides, reading through them, reading the analysis of the judges. The judges often have an analysis back to the law where these forced vaccines are permitted in various states. As part of that, though, what we found is interesting is we have some states, and we'll talk about Pennsylvania here in a bit as just kind of an example of it. Pennsylvania does not actually have a law that allows a forced vaccine, according to their pandemic bench guide. But the judges in Pennsylvania have reasoned that the state still has the power to potentially force vaccines under common law imported from England from the 1600s. So that is the type of analysis that I think most people would find shocking, that, your government hasn't even taken a vote, hasn't even said that they want to enable forced vaccines, but the judges are reaching back to common law principles from 1600s England to say that the state has the authority to give you a forced vaccine. And I see Lewis laughing right there. But yeah, so that is the shocking nature of what we're going to start to uncover tonight. So, and more laws are proposed. So even if your state doesn't currently have a forced vaccine law, they are under consideration. As I talked about before, the New York State Bar Association is actually right now looking at forcing, or is looking at embracing a forced vaccine law and getting the New York State legislature to act on it. So we expect more states to be coming as this gets rolling here. So give me 1 second here. I'm going to pull the presentation up for you guys. Melissa, can you see that up there? Is that showing properly?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect.
A little bigger, but that looks good too.
I think I got it adjusted here. Is it coming out? Okay. Yep. All right. So we're going to be looking at these state laws and what we're seeing here, right? So we've identified a bucket of at least we have 8 states here that have explicit emergency forced vaccine powers, right? So you can see a list of them there. At least 8 states already have a forced vaccine law on their books. And we'll kind of distinguish them and talk about what's unique and different about them and give you an idea of what you're looking for if you're looking at one of these laws in your particular state. They usually concentrate power in some government official to determine whether you get vaccinated. In Florida, it's the state health officer. They get a lot of discretion and power under the statute. In Maryland, it's the governor. In Massachusetts, it's the Board of Health. So we really, these laws basically say, hey, we have an emergency. Here's a government official. This government official gets to decide whether people get forced vaccines or not. And that's, of course, very concerning because it doesn't have those rigors of analysis. And I think that's one of the core issues that Lewis, would make. And if there was ever a full constitutional challenge, it would be, hey, this law doesn't even have these kind of reviews or protections or safeguards, what we lawyers often refer to as strict scrutiny. The court's not looking over whether the legislature is doing the right thing. Lewis?
I was going to say, yeah, strict scrutiny should apply, especially when we're talking about state action and infringement upon fundamental rights like the right of privacy, the right to bodily autonomy, and medical determination.
Exactly. So, so it's very scary that they've set up this way. That is definitely one of the areas where
self-determination. Medical self-determination.
And that's one of the areas where these things would probably be challenged in a constitutional challenge. I would think that would definitely be something a court would pay a lot of attention to. But again, it's an uncertain role to go to the courts, particularly when the courts are preparing bench guides where they're saying they have these powers.
And how can you get to a court if the court is closed? And
Right.
essentially,
Yeah.
how do you actually get to have a judge rule on this?
Absolutely. And, the other part that's, like Florida, some states actually say, if we're going to force you to get vaccinated, we're going to have a hearing before you get forced vaccinated. Those are more protective. Florida does not set that procedure up within its law. It, in fact, says they can send a law enforcement officer. So if the courts are closed, cop shows up at your house, ready to stick you in handcuffs and drive you to the doctor's office, or potentially Florida allows these volunteers to be appointed by the state to give you a vaccine. So maybe you're not even getting your vaccine from a doctor. You're just getting it from some person who is running around sticking needles in people. Where's the court process? How do you get to the courthouse, when the officer's standing in your doorway, dragging you off into a police car to go to the doctor's office? So it's
That's happening already, Sean. It's happening with people being pulled off of planes and they're making them do tests for coronavirus. And these are very invasive tests that they're sticking the Q-tip all the way up into their nose. And how do you challenge that? I mean, this is the question I think lawyers are being presented with now when they're getting calls from people having horror stories, and they're being forced quarantined with officers, outside their homes or their hotels where they're being put up. This is it's scary. And I think this statutory framework has created this nightmare.
Exactly. So because these laws are on the books, then, and of course, the other side of the law, we're not going to get very deep of this, is, when you have a written law like this on the books, when the police officer acts in accordance with a written law, it's very hard to go after that police officer saying they acted wrongfully, because they're going to go to the court and say, well, I followed what the written law is. I didn't know the law was unconstitutional. I just did what the law said. And it'd be very hard to challenge that piece of it, right? You might be able to challenge the constitutionality of the law, but you probably would have a harder time challenging the actions of the officer, because the officer thought they were acting on a constitutional law because it was on the books. That's one of the real risks of having these types of laws on the books. As Sophia mentioned, religious exemptions, the conscientious objections, the type of stuff that we would typically see are not necessarily present for these laws. So we need to, be aware that all the ground that has been fought for in the childhood vaccine arena, getting an exemption for your religious, getting a conscious exemption, getting a medical exemption, they don't necessarily exist in these forced vaccine laws. Jacobson did acknowledge that there should be a medical exemption, but in Jacobson, there was not a medical exemption under the state law. And the Supreme Court kind of just glanced over and said, well, we assume that they'll do a medical exemption, and they just made it okay, even though there was no medical exemption. So very concerning on that side of it. You don't know what they're going to do. The New York State Bar Association, 89-page position paper in favor of everybody in the U.S. getting a forced vaccine, in fact, stated that there should not be religious or conscientious objections. They believe everybody should get a forced vaccine, regardless of what objections they might have, other than perhaps medical exemptions, if their doctor said so. So we'll jump into the first state law here, which is Florida. Of course, we did a much longer session 2 weeks ago, focusing on Florida's law. And what we've done here is, this is the actual text of the statute. For all of these, if you look up in the corner, you'll see the name of the state. You'll see the statutory reference. So you can go Google these and pull these right up on your computer and see them. All we've done here is we've kind of put in lowercase or put in smaller font the pieces of the law that are less relevant to our analysis tonight. I mean, there's still parts of the law, but they're not directly relevant. But if you look at the Florida law, you can see the public health officer has the ability to order testing, examination, and vaccination of people. There are some objection provisions, but if the state health officer decides that there's not a practical method to quarantine or isolate, it says the state health officer can use any means necessary to vaccinate or treat an individual, including, the next sentence says, they can use law enforcement officers to come force the vaccine. So Florida is one of the most aggressive laws that we've seen written, in that it gives this tremendous power, a lot of discretion to one person, and in fact enables the use of the police force. I'm going to toss it over to
Sean,
Sophia.
if I could just add to that.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment on some of the text you have up there about quarantine. Notice how it says means the separation of an individual who is not yet ill. That's interesting, considering quarantine is typically for someone who's sick, and I don't think it would, at least under my definition of quarantine, would qualify someone who's not yet ill. This is very troubling language. Whoever drafted, I'd like to talk to him.
Yeah, and the other part too, and we talked about constitutionality. Just another side note on Florida is this version of 381.00315 came into being in 2002 through an amendment. And when it did, the amendment was actually written about liability of first responders. And so a lot of the legislative discussion, a lot of the stuff that was voted on and was discussed was about liability of first responders. But underneath of it, they slid through this amendment where they gave this tremendous power to this public health officer, gave this forced vaccination authority, put in, again, as Lewis points out, very unusual language here that gives a lot of power. So, and it was all put under a different title and kind of slid through the state legislature. And the legislative analysis, we talked about constitutionality earlier. When bills go through the Florida legislature, it's handed to a staffer who's supposed to look at the law, do an analysis of it, and see if it's constitutional. The staffer who did the report raised no constitutional objections to this law. So it's concerning that it didn't get flagged at that level back in 2002 when it was implemented. So I'm going to toss it to Sophia, who's going to help us with Connecticut. Just as a side note, guys, I got the slides. Sophia's going to do the discussion. So you may see me moving the slides while she's talking there. And let's see here. Is Connecticut coming up on my presentation? I don't see it. Sophia, let me let you talk. I don't think I've got this. This Connecticut slide doesn't seem to be coming up here. So, but do you have the text of it? Can I hear you, Sophia? Hang on. She may be muted. Hang on.
Oh, there Sophia? We go.
Okay.
Yep, there we go.
Do you have the text of the Connecticut statute?
I do. I have it here.
For some reason, it's not popping up on my screen, so I apologize for that, folks. But she's gonna talk about it for us.
That's okay. You can Google it. It's Public Act number 03-236. It's an act concerning public health emergency response authority in Connecticut. If we got anybody out there watching from Connecticut or family in Connecticut. So Connecticut has some pretty, I'm not going to go into all the quarantine rules, but they have some pretty strict quarantine rules. Pretty much they'll put you in quarantine. No, we don't really have like a time frame for you getting out. But there, as far as vaccination, if there was a good law out there, this one had Section 6 has a option to refuse to be vaccinated for any reason. So the text reads, in the event of a public health emergency declared by the governor, which coronavirus has done, I think, for pretty much every state, declared a public health emergency. The commissioner, so that's the public health commissioner, that's who Connecticut puts in charge of this, as authorized by the governor, may issue an order for the vaccination of such individuals or individuals present within a geographic area as the commissioner deems reasonable and necessary in order to prevent the introduction or arrest the progress of the communicable disease or contamination. So that's pretty much a big geographic area. They're saying that they can order, say, if they're spreading in a certain area, they could order an entire geographic area to be vaccinated. It does go on to say, the commissioner shall inform individuals subject to such vaccination order of the benefits and risks, so that would be informed consent, which is nice, of the vaccine and an individual's option to refuse to be vaccinated for any reason, including but not limited to health, religious, or conscientious objections. No individual shall be vaccinated unless provided written consent for such vaccination. So I think one of the things I wanted to throw out there is just to know what your state's laws are. Lewis made a comment to me earlier that people standing up for your constitutional rights starts with yourself knowing what your rights are. So if you were in Connecticut and you knew your rights were to refuse this, you would have the ability to say no, versus just assuming the person there that's of authority is what he's saying is correct and accepting it. So knowing your rights is the most important step in this fight. So that's Connecticut.
All right, Georgia's already up on the screen now. So
Okay. So yeah, I think you've got the exact same section. D. Yeah. So Georgia's a little scary, and that's our closest state here in Florida. Requires persons to be vaccinated or immunized, examined, and treated. An individual shall be exempt from vaccination or immunization if the person or parent or legal guardian provides an affidavit that complies with DPH Rule 511-2207. I looked that up. That's actually the religious exemption that they provide for school children. So that was interesting. But then what's worse is they go on to say the department may require vaccination or immunization of those who object on the grounds of religious beliefs if it's determined that an epidemic or the threat of an epidemic exists. So they can overrule your religious exemptions or your proposed right to an exemption for religious reason if they believe that an epidemic or potential epidemic exists. So that's very scary. If you were in Georgia, I would say to take a look at this law and maybe get to going with some of your senators to get this removed, I think would be the best. They go on to say that they can restrict travel, limit or cancel public gatherings, which we've already seen done, close, evacuate, or decontaminate any facility, pretty much any public health control measures or with an administrative order, which we've seen done already in many states with the coronavirus pandemic.
Yep. Yeah, so I think Georgia is one of the ones that's pretty powerful. And again, they can override those beliefs. Again, a lot of power all put in the Department of Health here in Georgia, right? So that's what we're going to notice. It's pretty much a trend throughout all the states is the concentration of power in one or a limited set of government officials. I'm now going to jump to Maryland. Maryland, of course, is Maryland state I was raised in, so I find it interesting to look back here. And Maryland has a forced vaccine law. So if you look at, Public Safety 14-3A-03, once we have a state of emergency, the governor can decide if it's medically necessary and reasonable to force vaccines upon people, require individuals to submit to vaccination or medical treatment, unless it will likely cause serious harm. Likely cause serious harm, right? So it's not has a chance of causing medical harm. It has to be likely that the particular vaccine will cause serious harm. So I don't think you're going to get much of an exemption for the risk of the vaccine here. So the governor in Maryland theoretically has the power to force everybody to get a vaccine. Maryland's law has a kicker. It's one of the two. Florida has the kicker of the law enforcement officers potentially helping or forcing you to get the vaccine. Maryland has a kicker in subsection C here, which says the governor can order healthcare providers who will not voluntarily participate to participate in the treatment and suppression efforts. So not only can Maryland potentially force its residents to get a vaccine, but Maryland can also compel its doctors to have to give the vaccine. So that is a very unusual provision. We haven't seen it in other states, but it's very concerning, as you can imagine, because it's kind of a 1-2 punch. If you thought your doctors were going to help protect you, now they're under the compulsion of the governor to treat you. Sophia, Arizona?
Okay, Arizona. Do you have a slide on Arizona?
Yes, Arizona's up on the screen
okay.
now.
So Arizona, I think you can see it here. This is, if you just Google this, it will come up. What I do with these is then just do a search for either vaccination or immunization, and it will come up. You can see how many times it's mentioned, and then you can go right to where it discusses the vaccination. So we've got Arizona is going to mandate treatment or vaccination of persons who are diagnosed with illness resulting from exposure or who are reasonably believed to have been exposed or who may reasonably be expected to be exposed. I don't really like that too much because we see this with the coronavirus. We've got people who were in contact with someone, may have been in contact with someone. Those people then need to be quarantined. They are not showing any symptoms, but they're now asymptomatic. So this law also, I don't know if you've got this in here about the smallpox. Let me find that. Oh, there it is. Okay, so in Part C, in addition to the authority provided in subsection during a state of emergency or state of war emergency, in which there's an occurrence or imminent threat of smallpox. We don't really worry about that. Plague, that's a new one. Viral hemorrhagic fever or highly contagious. I think COVID would fall under that. Highly fatal, that's arguable with COVID, with transmission characteristics similar to smallpox. The governor, in consultation with the director of the Department of Health Services, may issue the orders. So they're giving it to the governor and then the director of the Department of Health Services. And I'm not real fond of this law because it's too vague. I think it gives. I think COVID could easily be said to be put under this guideline right here, isolate and quarantine persons as well. And then we also add in National Guard shall enforce orders issued by the governor. So that's the kicker on, I think, Arizona, is we can now bring in the National Guard to enforce this.
Yeah, and I think that part that you brought in there too is very interesting. I mean, it's not just people who've been exposed to it; it's people who may reasonably be expected to be exposed. So I think it gives the state a very broad brush to paint with. Illinois is another forced vaccine law. It works somewhat like Connecticut, but differently. Basically, the Illinois rule says indeed they can force a vaccine. Again, written notice. So what happens with some of these state legislations is they copy from each other. So a lot of times when a state's considering a rule, they look to other states. So I see a lot of parallels here between the Connecticut rule that was discussed earlier with Sophia and Illinois. Now, Illinois is a little different in that it says that they can force the vaccine, but then if you refuse to get the vaccine, then you'll be put into isolation or quarantine. So it ends up basically with the same result. In a legal case, some of this technical wording can make a difference, but the idea is Illinois has the ability to administer and treatment to prevent the spread of disease. But if you object, then you're going to get tossed into quarantine or isolation. So even with the states that have these a lot more states have quarantine and isolation than forced vaccines from what we've seen so far in our studies. Even with a quarantine or isolation, there's the real chance that the state is going to, kick back and, stick you in quarantine and isolation indefinitely. So, the practical side of this becomes, even if they can't force you to take the vaccine, they can make your life miserable for not taking the vaccine. Massachusetts, is kind of the granddaddy of this. That was the underlying of the Jacobson case that we've talked about back in 1905. They appear to have the same law on the books right now. And it basically says if your local board of health decides it's necessary for public health or safety, they can require a forced vaccination. And again, if you don't, it's a $5 fine. So Massachusetts may need to update their law if they really want to enforce it, because I think most people would just pay $5 and not take the vaccine. But we're probably going to see higher fines on these, and from what we're hearing, with a lot of people saying they need everybody to take the vaccine, they need high participation rates. I think the forced vaccine issue may be forced in more places. Toss it to Sophia for Texas, and I think Texas is one of the ones where the slide's missing as well. So if you want to reference it, just talk through it.
Okay.
Sean, they're fining people $250 and $500 for not wearing the mask. I can't imagine what they're going to be fining people for not getting vaccinated.
I got to imagine the vaccine fine is going to be much higher than that.
Yeah. Okay, Texas. A lot of people think, well, Texas is one of those that's standing up for their rights. But we did find on there, let me see what this is labeled, pandemic influenza response. And then I also have Health and Safety Code Title 2, Chapter 81, Communicable Diseases. That's where we're taking this information from. If you are from Texas or know someone there, want to look into it. Control measures, actions necessary to prevent and control the spread of communicable disease include, but are not limited to, immunization, detection, detention, restriction, disinfection, decontamination, isolation, quarantine, chemoprophylaxis, preventative therapy, prevention, and education. Chapter 81 of the Texas Health and Safety Codes allows control measures to be imposed on individuals, property areas, or common carriers. So they don't have a specific vaccination law like Florida, but paint a very broad picture of what they can do in their control measures. They do have a state mask mandate that just went into effect there. I know a lot of Texans are not very happy about that, and that's interesting to see. And then we now have their control measures listed as immunization, detention, restriction. So kind of more of the same language that you would see in some of the other states, just not very specific, in my opinion.
Wonderful. New Mexico. You want to move on to that one?
Yep, I got New Mexico. Do you have a slide on there? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, it's up. New Mexico's up.
Here we go. New Mexico has a right to refuse medical treatment, testing, physical or mental examination, vaccination, specimen collection. However, such refusal may lead respondent continued isolation or quarantine under the provisions of the Public Health Emergency Response Act. That I found very interesting, that they were going to allow refusal, but then of course you would need to continue to be contained. We've got, again, a public health emergency. Secretary of Health, vaccinate persons to prevent infection by threatening communicable diseases and protect against the spread of that disease. A qualified person, authorized Secretary of Health, may vaccinate a minor unless the minor or minor's duly authorized representative. A certificate, I don't know what certificate this they're referencing, maybe an exemption, duly licensed physician or advanced practice registered nurse, states the minor's physical condition. So I guess that would be just like a medical exemption here, written doctor's note. So New Mexico was pretty strict. Also back in the public health officials' control. And that's one of the things, is we're putting all of the power into a public health official. There's nothing in here about due process or the chance to object. That's kind of what we want to bring to everyone's attention. It's not necessarily, well, what if I have, these issues, where's my medical exemption? It doesn't talk anything about that for adults. That's the problem with these laws. It's not written in here. As you can see, there's no, okay, we need to bring you before a judge. And of course, like Lewis said, the courts are probably going to be closed if it is a pandemic. So that's why we need to bring awareness to these laws. This is a big issue.
Fantastic. Yep. Lewis, were you going to say something? Was that picking up?
That wasn't me, but I have a question. So does this panel like the Connecticut model?
Well, I'm not saying we like it, but I think it's at least a better direction than some of these others, right? These are kind of on a scale, and I'm going to show you at the end here kind of a presentation that one of our volunteers so aptly put together that kind of looks at the different powers of the different states relative to each other. I mean, there's a range of options here, and I think there is some balancing of public health versus individual liberty. I'm a very strong individual liberty advocate personally, and I would err to the side of giving people the choice. I know other people are other places on the range, but at least some models give more protection to individuals than the others, where there's no judicial review and there's no notification and there's no discussion of the risks.
I don't think any of us are real. If you're in this movement, you probably aren't pro any mandatory government control of your body, right? So I think we can all probably agree here that we're not for it. But the range of the statutes that we're seeing from state to state varies considerably. And of course, those can change at any time. So as much as I'd like to say, I'll just up and leave, which I can't because I'm only licensed here in Florida, I would have to find a different profession. That's why it's like, you don't really want to move your whole family just because of this, but you ultimately would, if that's, you're passionate about it, you don't want the government deciding your health choices for you, you probably would leave. But if we can make changes in our state, we can better the state that we live in and hopefully stay. If not, then yeah, we probably would have to leave.
Yep. All right. Well, I'm going to move on to Virginia now. Virginia has another one of these forced laws, and basically says the commissioner of public health in Virginia can require immediate immunization of all persons in the case of an epidemic. So, not a lot of exemptions or protections here. So basically, if we get into a public health emergency in Virginia, you have got a commissioner who can require immediate vaccination. So that's concerning. Pennsylvania, this is coming out of their pandemic bench guides, and basically says, this is interesting. It says, while individuals in Pennsylvania have a right to refuse medical treatment, that right may be outweighed when an individual with a communicable disease poses a significant risk to the health of others, and there are no lesser restrictive means of protecting the public's health. So despite the lack of an actual written law, and there is a reference to a general involuntary treatment, but there's not a public health emergency type law like we've seen in the other states. But still, Pennsylvania, the judges in their pandemic bench guide have reasoned that they have the power to compel people to take a vaccine. Further, and I think I'm going to see if I can switch screens here with you, and I've actually pulled up the pandemic bench guide in Pennsylvania here with you, and hopefully it's going to cross over here on the screen in just a second. But in Pennsylvania, their pandemic bench guide actually references a doctrine of parens pari, which basically says the state is the parent of the country. And this is from back when we had the King of England under the English constitutional system. The king retained powers in his capacity as the father of the country, and is one of the most essential and least limitable powers in the Commonwealth of the state of Pennsylvania. It imposes an affirmative duty upon the state to protect its citizens. Under that doctrine, the Commonwealth can act to protect the health and safety and welfare of the public at large. So, in fact, it says, as with these police powers, the state must act on behalf of all of its citizens rather than to protect the interests of a specific individual or a particular group of individuals. So you've seen it here, folks. Pennsylvania judges have reached back into the king's power, the king that we threw out of office with the Declaration of Independence that we celebrated a few days ago. The state of Pennsylvania has recognized his power and said that is their authority for potentially forcing people to get a vaccine. So, yeah, that's shocking. And then, Sophia, if you want to jump into Ohio for a sec.
Yeah. Ohio is my home state. Shout out to everyone from Ohio that's watching. We don't have anything specific on point to vaccination, but they have very strong quarantine laws. In fact, they employ quarantine guards that have police power to guard you in your home or wherever they're detaining you. That was interesting. I hadn't seen that anywhere. What I did see, though, was in the Ohio pandemic bench guide, the instructions for the judges, they do reference Jacobson, that case that we were talking about earlier. So as Sean was saying earlier, while they don't have anything specific on forced vaccinations, it's clear that they are looking to those type of cases for guidance. And so if we do see a forced vaccination come up, please keep your eye out for any laws that might be coming around, case law that might be coming around regarding enforcement of vaccines, because just because it isn't already on the books doesn't mean that a court might not decide that they think they have the power to do so. So just be aware. But this, very interesting. Police powers. I put a side note here. Employment of quarantine guards. In the event of a quarantine or isolation, the local health district may employ persons to execute its orders and guard any house or place containing any affected person with or exposed to a quarantinable disease. The police powers, the person employed as a quarantine guard have police powers and may use all necessary means to enforce 3707.01 and local health district orders. And Ohio also gave a lot of power to the local districts. So Ohio is a state where you've got cities and then you have completely rural areas where there's no one. So they pushed a lot of the power into the specific cities and counties and put it into smaller governments. So you might see different orders coming out depending on the area that you live in. And I think that's because of the diverse makeup of Ohio. That's Ohio for you.
Wonderful. Well, Sophia, why don't you talk a little bit about how to we're starting to see the Q&A, and of course, folks, stick around here because shortly we're going to wrap up the formal program and we're going to go to Q&A. We've seen a lot of wonderful questions coming in. But Sophia, how are laws changed? If somebody says, "Hey, I don't like my laws," what's
yeah, I'm sure that's what you guys are thinking. You're like, great, thanks for all this terrible information. Now what are we supposed to do with it, right? We're not here to bring bad news. We just want people to be aware of what's going on, so that honestly, like I will tell you, I was not somebody that was looking to my local officials to see what their ideas were on medical freedom. That wasn't even anything that crossed my mind. And I think what we have seen with COVID, if anything, is that your local officials have so much power, right? So I saw the cities in Ohio voting on mask mandates, and our cities have been voting on mask mandates. And it changes by the city or the county. So it's going to be very local. So that means bring your complaints and your discussion to your local legislatures. Look into who's going to be your governor. Look who's going to be who's going to be your mayor. Whatever your local officials, your city officials, find out what their position is on medical freedom. And they're always, they want to talk, they want to do hobnobs. That's great. Go and ask those hard questions so that you can put somebody in the place that's going to support your choices. We in Florida have partnering with a lot of the people that are running. We are in an election year this year. A lot of people that are running for the legislature that we're going to be talking to that support our position, and we want to raise those people up so that they're aware that they have our support. So please reach out to local officials. That's how we get laws changed, and I think that that's where we need to focus. Obviously, yes, we want to end goal, guys. I do want to repeal the 1986 Vaccine Injury Act. Like, I'm all for it. I am, watching if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his team do the work. He's an amazing attorney. That is obviously the end goal. We do want to make big steps at the federal level, but we're trying to start right now in our communities and make changes and branch it out from there. So please speak to your family about medical freedom. It does not need to be a pro or anti discussion. That is not what this is about. This is about our government intrusion onto our bodily choices. And I think that we can all agree that what we have witnessed is that the government does have a lot of power, and it comes out of nowhere. I didn't even think about the mask mandate till it came up. I thought about the quarantine issue and people not being able to work and people being locked in their homes. And then this mask thing came out of nowhere. And now all of a sudden it's all we talk about. There's been multiple fights about masks. So try to make changes at local levels and vote for those people that are going to be for medical freedom, your civil liberties, your individual rights, whatever you want to call it. Ask those questions.
Thank you, Sophia. Here's kind of an overview of the state laws. And I think the states are not showing up properly on the PowerPoint here, but generally you can see there's a range of the effectiveness, right? A lot of states you can see there's a number of cluster of states that have forced vaccination. They're up at the top of the cluster here. And then there's states with the quarantine and isolation and testing. And then we have less states that just have testing. So, and you can see the power grid, a lot of these are really using appointed third parties to do this. So a lot of times it's that state health officer, right, who's picked, usually by the governor or some executive person in the government. They were never even elected by the electorate, and they're given the power. So you can see a lot of power clustered up there. It varies by state. And, our recommendation is if you're in a state with, forced vaccinations and the quarantine and testing, get these laws off the books. If you're in a state with the quarantine isolation, you want to start amending these laws to take the power away, particularly away from forced vaccines. You've got to get aware with what your local law is and really take it from there. And that kind of brings me to the call to action. If you're somebody that's passionate about this and you believe in this cause and you want to spread awareness, because that's really where we are right now, is we want to get more people aware of these laws. If you're somebody who wants to jump in on the awareness train and start getting more people in the know, I would welcome you to reach out to us. Florida Freedom Keepers has a form available. I think it's on the link here with our presentation. And let us know that you want to get involved. We'd love to get people in other states. We started this movement in Florida, but we think in order to make the kind of change we need, it's going to have to be a national movement, first on these forced vaccine laws. And as we get momentum there, we can start looking at the 1986 Act. Can we get a national movement going there? That's going to have to be a broad-based move involving probably all of the states in order to be successful. And of course, now we have microchipping laws, mask mandates, other things that are related to this coming along too. So, if you're interested in this, you want to help us research, find the laws in more states, help us get the word out to more people. We are looking for people who are passionate, that are willing to spread the word and help us do those grassroots seeds of knowledge for other people. And we hope you'll mark your calendars, come back and join us on July 21st, 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll be doing a town hall with some politicians, asking them the tough questions about this, and also asking the politically involved people, how would they go about changing the laws and really laying those seeds. I'm going to turn it back to Melissa, who I know is prepping for our Q&A. I'm seeing some wonderful questions and I'm looking forward to answering there. But I'll let you talk for a minute, Melissa, and then maybe we'll jump into some of the Q&A.
Thank you guys so much. That was a mind-blowing presentation. I think we all learned a lot tonight by what you guys shared. I think a lot of us are shocked and blown away. I know me personally, my home state is New Mexico, and it's quite sad, in Florida, of course, but it's quite sad to see that these laws already exist. That was someone's comment. Are these up and coming laws? But these are actually laws that are currently in the book. I just want to reiterate what Sophia said about getting involved and getting active. In Florida, this is a voting year, and Florida Freedom Keepers has a lot of ways for you to get involved politically. Please join us for the event coming up here with Sean and the crew for us doing a town hall virtually. But if you go to flfreedomkeepers.org, we have ways that you can find your local Senate district, you can find your House district. We make it very user-friendly for you to know who's up for election. So it's really important for us to get involved. So thank you guys so much for this incredible presentation. I know some of this information can be a really hard pill to swallow, but activism and awareness, they go hand in hand, and education is how we make a difference. We need to take this to the legislators and really make a powerful change. So I wanted to go over some of the predominant questions I saw. You guys had great questions. I know a few things were covered. So some of the questions I wanted to present to the lawyers today for some discussion. And if you guys want to add more questions, I'll write them down. I know Susan Callahan, she wanted to clarify what's considered a pandemic.
Well, so I mean, there's the World Health Organization definition of pandemic, but then what happens is, most of the states have something called a state of emergency. So that will then kick to, the governor's office that will declare an emergency, or, in the Florida statute, basically the state health officer has the ability to declare an emergency situation from the medical side. So once declared, a lot of, and that's actually a misunderstanding of the Florida law, right? The state health officer can declare this state of emergency, and then it says they should attempt to consult with the governor. But really, the state health officer, once they declare the state of emergency, they're off and running to do what they want to do under this pandemic law. So the pandemic definition, you have the World Health Organization, you kind of have the public health version of it, then you have these state laws. So you really have to dig into your state law and understand what a state of emergency is, or pandemic that triggers these types of laws to come into being. And that's going to vary a little bit from state to state. Anybody else?
Yeah, every state is different. Oh, did anyone want to comment on that one?
No.
I have, I'm going to combine two people. Adri does keto stuff, and Sarah Alvarlos both had a similar question, so I'll just ask them and you guys can decide. Adri says, who would be the ultimate decider of forcing a vaccine nationwide? And the second part to that question would be, can federal be passed to wipe out forced vaccination?
Lewis, you want to take this one, or I can take it too?
Go for it. Go for it, Sean. I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah, so
that's a loaded question.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit in our other presentation, so we didn't cover it tonight, but back on 6/24, when we did the Florida forced vaccination, we started with the U.S. Constitution, And we talked about the difference between the federal system and the state system. And the federal government really has, believe it or not, limited powers under the Constitution. And they can only do certain things. And anything the federal government can't do is pass to the states. But as part of the federal government's power, there is what's called the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause says the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. That's how the 1986 Act comes into being, right? Is you have the Commerce Clause. Federal government says we need to protect vaccine manufacturers or there won't be sufficient vaccines throughout the country. It's interstate commerce. Supreme Court ends up upholding that. So you could potentially make an argument under the Commerce Clause that a vaccine issue is interstate commerce. So the federal government potentially could grab the power there. But I see that could be more of a pro-vaccine movement, right? The federal government could argue that we need to do a vaccine for interstate commerce. I think the federal government would have a harder time arguing that that not allowing a vaccine would be interstate commerce, right? Because then not allowing the vaccine is not promoting interstate commerce. So I think the federal government could try to grab the power and force a vaccine like they did with the 1986 Act. I think the federal government would have a harder time passing a law that says you states can't force vaccinate because it would be harder to make that Commerce Clause argument. Lewis?
Sean, I agree. I think under the U.S. Constitution, state legislatures hold the majority of the power when it comes to health, public health laws. And they're the ones who regulate how forced vaccination will happen in each state. So can there be a uniform nationwide reform? Perhaps, and maybe that's something that we should be considering as a nation. I think we should be having a discussion on a wider scale about this. And I think for people who don't really understand their state law or their state public health officers, policies, they can use public record requests to ask for policies, procedures, manuals, things like that, so they can find out more information about these laws. Unfortunately, we've tried to make public record requests for the Florida Department of Health, and we haven't gotten much by way of anything when it comes to the information we would like to know and the questions that we have about how, for example, Florida Statute 381.00315 is being used, and how the officers or officials and state employees who are involved in this process, how they're instructed, or what policies and guidelines are they following, when they're going door to door, or whatever they're doing, whether it's quarantining or requiring people to do medical treatments for disease prevention. I think people have a lot of questions that they should be directing to their state health officers. Formally, make sure you invoke your state, public records law, so that they have to respond. And if they don't, you can petition the court to get those records.
Yeah. Oh, and one thing I'll throw in too, I just thought of it while Lewis was talking is, kind of the gold standard is if you could get a U.S. constitutional amendment that said you can't have mandated medical procedures or something to that effect, that would kind of fix all of this. But of course, you've got to go through the process of getting a U.S. constitutional amendment, which is not an easy process. But that would be your one chance easily to fix it federally, is if you could get the support to get a constitutional amendment on the U.S. Constitution. Mm. And state constitutions can then be the next layer of protection, right? We've already kind of had some preliminary talks about amending the Florida Constitution to make this medical freedom very clear and very ingrained. Usually constitutions give you more protection than laws because laws are very easy to amend. Constitutions are typically harder to amend.
And state constitutions are far easier to amend than the U.S. Constitution.
The U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
And then Lewis, just to touch on your point, Love Cohen says, can you write up the steps necessary to make a public records request? I know we talked about that 2 weeks ago, but what is the process? Is that something that you can explain or write in the comments?
I can explain it. It's because it's simple. It's as easy as asking for the records and finding the records custodian for the specific agency that you're requesting records from. Most of the agencies in Florida, whether it's a county department of health or a state office, you can email them. They have a website. They'll even have what they prefer, or how they prefer the request to be made on their website. So depending on who you're asking, I think you should adjust your request accordingly. If they prefer email, I suggest using email, and especially because your request itself, once it's made, it will be a public record as well. So they can't pretend like they didn't get it. So, in the old days, you had to send a certified letter to make sure they got it. But, this day and age, we now can send things electronically and have proof of service. Unfortunately, in Florida, there's no statutory time requirement for the state to respond to, or, a state agency to respond to public records requests. But other states may be different, and they may have actual time frames. So that'll vary depending on the type of request, how long it will take to get the records. But if you're not getting records, or there are no records, you should get that in writing. And you should also, of course, follow up on the requests. And if you need to, make a petition to the court to get the records, especially if they're stonewalling you or mounting an objection. We've seen all kinds of objections to producing records. That goes from claiming there's an investigation going on or something to privileges. So, and if anybody's having trouble making public record requests, they can contact my office or any other attorney who's, in that realm.
Thank you. Sophia, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, if anyone isn't following Lewis on Facebook, you can just follow him, and he posts a lot of good information. He is a civil rights attorney, so he posts a lot of good stuff. Just a shout out to him. He's doing a lot of work with the mask mandates, but I started following him, just getting his post updates a long time ago, and then when our paths crossed here. But it's really, obviously, I'm a personal injury attorney, and one of the areas of law I would like to go into, if it ever happens, would be to sue the vaccine manufacturers for injuries. So obviously, the one thing we do want to see is the 1986 Act repealed so that we can make vaccine manufacturers liable again. But that's a big challenge. And so right now, I would just encourage people to find out what their state laws are, talk to people, even if it's just, I don't know how to say it, but like just random, whoever you're having interactions with, like, hey, did you know that Florida has a forced vaccination law? Keep that statute handy and just have them pull it up. I talked to some tenant came in to the office tonight as I was finishing up. He's like, oh, what are you doing here so late? And I'm like, well, I'm doing this show. And I'm like, do I tell him what I'm doing? Because I don't know how he's going to feel. Is he going to judge me? And I told him, and he was like, wow, that's crazy. In fact, I believe that my brother got autism from being vaccinated, but, I still vaccinate my kids. But, so people are open to having the conversation if you're not pushing it as a pro or anti issue. So maybe just bringing more people into awareness, is going to help, I think, the whole cause move forward.
Right. And one thing we talked about last time was this kind of perfect storm, and I think Sophia started to hit on it, right? So now we've got potentially forced vaccine laws, which, we've talked about the constitutionality, but we don't know what a court's going to do. So you got a forced vaccine, you've got a large scale, potentially federal buy of vaccines, which has been talked about, where they're going to go out and buy these things in mass quantities. And then we have no liability for the manufacturer. So there's a real incentive issue here. If you're a fan of economics like I am, everybody's got an incentive to produce a bunch of vaccines and sell them to the federal government. But they don't have the huge incentives to be super safe about the vaccines because it doesn't matter, right? Because they've got liability protection on the back end. So the incentives are lining up very poorly for protecting the population. Meanwhile, there's also articles out there that I was just starting to review today about, how they're shortening the cycle, shortening the testing process. So not only do we have a quickly rushed vaccine without the incentives, with this federal money floating out there to get people incentivized to produce them quickly, but then they're not even doing the same testing they need to do on usual vaccines. They're cutting the corners on the testing standards. So a lot of things are coming together in a very dangerous way.
And they're giving themselves liability. I'm sorry, they're giving themselves immunity from liability for these, not only the vaccines, but any treatment for the novel viruses. which I think is a concern for everybody, especially those, concerned about getting COVID or something. If they misdiagnose you or they commit malpractice, you shouldn't be unable to seek recourse. That's very alarming, and I think we're seeing so many things that we've never seen before. And I've talked to colleagues who've been presented with challenges that are just it's hard to believe. And I think that's because a lot of people have not been paying attention to what's been going on and the changes in the laws. I mean, the framework, the legal framework's been put into place to make this stuff look lawful, but nobody's really taken the time to really analyze it. And I think why there hasn't been a challenge to Jacobson is because there's been a reluctance of people to go to the courts, and also fear and uncertainty with that process and what could happen. I mean, you could very well create bad precedent, and this becomes constitutional, so to speak. So I think people, I'm not trying to deter legal action. And when it comes to things like, the mask mandates, which we're faced with right now, you have to take legal action. And like Sophia so eloquently said, it's important to know your rights and assert them. That's a big issue when it comes to constitutional challenges, because if you waive your rights, right, if you just allow things to happen that you believe to be unconstitutional, then you're essentially doing what's called a waiver. And in court, it's like a voluntary relinquishment of your right. And you could have resisted, but you chose not to. And I think when we're talking about, a shot going in the arm, once it's put into you, it's too late to object, right? Once you've consented, let's say. So I think people, more than anything, before this gets to a court, remember the challenge starts, with your individual choice and your decision to for example, put on the mask when someone tells you to put on the mask, which might make them feel good, might make you feel good. But if you have a right not to wear the mask, right, why are you putting it on? If you have a right not to wear it, why would you put it on? You're waiving your right. You're waiving your right to say no. And that's why I'm representing, several Palm Beach County residents who, are not okay with forced medical treatments and do not want to waive their rights. And I think anybody who has a problem with that, should definitely challenge it at any way possible, at every level possible.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I appreciate all the comments you guys have made so far. And I think that the reason why we educate and raise awareness, and I love Sophia's example of just being brave enough to say something. And the great thing about this not is anti-vaccine or pro-vaccine. This is individual liberties. This is about making individual personalized medical choices. And so when we have these conversations, I'm a hairstylist in Winter Park, Florida, and I can see a wide range of my clients. And some are like, I've been vaccinated my whole life, but man, I would never get that vaccine. And I always say, it's your choice, and just have informed consent. And I say, because they'll be like, oh, I can't wait for this vaccine to come out. And I'll go, okay, comes gift with purchase, comes with a microchip, just so you know. And they're like, what? It has a microchip? And I'm like, yeah, there's like availability for microchipping and tracking. And they're like, I had no idea. And I always reference it. You're free to choose whatever. If you want to choose the vaccine, that's your personal choice. But I would love to offer some additional education. And so that's why we just want to oppose vaccine mandates like we oppose mask mandates. We want to be able to govern ourselves. I mean, that's how America was established. We the people can be self-governing. This kind of goes in line with the next question we have by Dan. And this have already been covered, but I thought this was a good question to reference again. Do state health statutes override the state's constitution? Could a state Supreme Court review and rule constitutional privacy / due process rights prevail over a health official's decision?
Yeah, well, the state always laws are written are subject to the Constitution. The Constitution is the higher level of legal analysis, right? So always, every law is subject to constitutional analysis. And as Lewis will tell you, I mean, over the years, over the course of the U.S. History, we've had many laws that were written, passed, signed into being, and they were unconstitutional. So we have a long history of the Constitution is supposed to be the fundamental framework and protection, and it's set up that way. And then if you do a law that doesn't comport with the Constitution, it's invalid. So that is always a part of the analysis. Again, we kind of have taken the position we don't like these laws. We think they have real constitutional issues. The problem is there's a machine of people that are pushing them and trying to shove them into constitutional holes. And you don't know until you get to the court whether the court's going to say constitutional or unconstitutional.
And I think another thing that we're seeing as well is not only is the push for these vaccine laws, but the narrative and the community collaborative. So creating this, if you're not wearing a mask, so let's say we think, masks mandates are a prelude for vaccine mandates. Yeah. It's a cultural conditioning. So we see now, I'm in Seminole County, but I see it throughout Florida, and it may be different in your states, where you can call on a business that isn't adhering to the mask mandates. Call on your neighbor, and it's actually encouraged. This type of behavior is encouraged, and we understand that that's not an American principle. That's not a principle of I'll take care of my health, you take care of your health. This whole ploy of you have to be responsible for the public safety, and now we're going to have to quarantine you and isolate you and force a medical procedure on you. So the narrative is getting stronger and stronger. The fear, if you're not wearing a mask, you're dangerous, you're killing grandmas, you're unsafe. So not only are we raising awareness for what's happening, we also have to raise awareness for the narrative, for what's being pushed culturally. It's a conditioning, and it starts slowly, but it's going to escalate. And as we can see, what makes these laws so dangerous is that the laws are already existing. And then the cultural narrative of people fighting you and division and are you a mask wearer? Are you not a mask wearer? Is of course a prelude to, are you getting a vaccine? And you have to get a vaccine for my vaccine to work. It's a public safety threat now. So I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Well, one thing I've kind of developed as I've been involved with this more and more and talked to more people and got deeper in it is, at the end of the day, this is a moral issue. And my belief as a human is it's immoral for somebody else to say, you have to take a vaccine for my benefit, right? There were people in this country, 200 years ago that thought it would be good to force other people against their will to work on their farms, right? And it was great for the person that was forcing the other person to do labor against their will because they were accruing the benefits and, denying the humanity of the person they were forcing to labor on their farm. We rejected that as a country because it's immoral and it's incorrect as human rights. The same analysis applies here. It is immoral to go to somebody and say, I'm going to force you to do something and subject you to risk, possibly to death. And again, if these vaccines, regardless of how safe they are, if you vaccinate a large enough quantity of people, people will die from the vaccine. You are literally going to kill people, arguably to accrue a benefit to another group of people. And under what moral standards is anybody empowered to make that decision for somebody else? I'm going to kill some of these people over here because I want to save some of these people over here. It's not something we should be doing as a society.
And it doesn't survive strict scrutiny. I think people need to always think back to if they're going to bring a challenge, just to go back to the question, Melissa, about bringing a court challenge, understand that the courts, when they view a right of privacy or an infringement upon a right of privacy in a constitutional challenge, they're going to look at an infringement upon, let's say, the right of self-determination and bodily autonomy as presumptively unconstitutional. So then the burden shifts to the state or whoever's trying to.
Lewis?
Did we lose him?
think his mic cut out. I still see him up on the screen. Yeah, but he raised an important point about strict scrutiny, which is, when a state is imposing on somebody's fundamental rights, and of course your right to protect your health is, basically upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court as being a fundamental right. When you're going against somebody's fundamental right, at least in the more modern cases after Jacobson, they've applied this strict scrutiny where the legislature needs to weigh the risks and benefits on both sides, needs to make sure that there's no less restrictive way or less dangerous way to do it. Unfortunately, Jacobson was decided in 1905 before the Supreme Court kind of started adding new layers of analysis for some of the fundamental constitutional rights. But a lot of people do believe that strict scrutiny is the standard, which means there should be weighing these risks and benefits on both sides and saying, even the mask wearing, as we were talking about mask wearing earlier, just 2 or 3 months ago, the government was saying it was dangerous for non-medical personnel to wear masks because it would potentially, you would touch your face, you would transmit the virus, etc. And suddenly I don't see any discussion of the risk, but 3 months ago, we were informed that these were very risky to wear masks if we weren't doctors. And that is the type of thing that I think opens an attack on these laws, on the mask mandates and later the forced vaccines, because there is a risk, there is a danger that you're imposing on one group of people to benefit another group of people. And at the very least, it being immoral, as I argue, but also, from a legal standpoint, it should probably be in a land of strict scrutiny. The government should be looking at that and saying, hey, we can't put risk and danger upon a group of people unless we really do a detailed analysis and we figure out there's no other way to protect the health.
I think with so much, to follow up to what Sean was saying, I think with so much back and forth on the COVID situation, our government has really shown its cards on what they do know, what they don't know, and all this back and forth has done nothing but create confusion for people. Like Sean said, we saw so much stuff, regardless of how everyone feels about the mask thing. Like, I know this virus is real. I know people that have had it. It's definitely out there, and I know there are susceptible people to it. My mother-in-law is one of them, and we need to protect them. But the mask science and the vaccine science is just not there to support overriding people's rights. And that's ultimately what we're saying, is that the rights that we have as Americans, as what our Constitution has provided, just doesn't override what this government wish-wash back and forth over. Does it work? Does it not work? We're not sure. Does it spread by asymptomatic? We're not really sure. All this back and forth has done nothing but lessened our belief in the powers that they say that they have, because we're all like, wait a second, I thought that we weren't wearing masks, but now we are. And that's going to just continue on until this vaccine pops up, because now we have something even more invasive being forced potentially. And the science behind that, combined with no liability, is going to, I think, raise some eyebrows for people that haven't thought about it, maybe who are all for masks. They're like, wait a second, I don't know if I want to get a vaccine now. I don't know if that's pretty invasive. So I'm sure you have more questions, Melissa, but just to follow up what Sean was saying there.
I think that's great. I think I'll just go with one more question, and then we can wrap up your guys' thoughts. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay, you guys are doing excellent. Okay, so this was just a clarification question by Louisa. Can we sue the officials mandating these orders? Not the county, but the actual officials. So they're just looking to see who is actually getting sued. For example, in Lewis's lawsuit, is it the actual officials or is it the county?
In our lawsuit, we sue just the county. And if you look at most of the challenges to the mask mandates, the plaintiffs are suing only the county. You could technically sue an individual. You could sue anybody, but will it survive a motion to dismiss? Will the court give them qualified immunity? These are the reasons why most of the time when you challenge, like a county ordinance or something, you would target just the county or the city itself, and not name an official, because the official is going to essentially claim immunity and possibly be dismissed. And you can achieve the same aim challenging the statute or the ordinance or the emergency order by going after the specific agency that's issuing the edict.
Yeah, usually they've embodied laws protecting themselves from getting sued. So usually it's hard to sue a public official for their actions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you can, but should you? Probably not, unless you want it to be dismissed and have to do more work to fix your complaint. So unfortunately, especially in Florida and the 11th Circuit, most officials, including police officers and public employees who do things wrong and are sued, will end up getting qualified immunity because the courts will essentially, give them a pass, and that's an issue. And I think it's something we should address as well, because officials should be held accountable, especially when what they're doing is clearly unlawful.
Yeah, I agree. And you can see throughout the state a lot of frustration that's happening. So I think we can wrap up with final thoughts. If you guys want to share your final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up the call for tonight, an incredible call. So I'll turn it over to Sophia, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks everyone for sticking through us. I think we're at 2 hours, so I know it's been a lot of information. And for coming from someone who I am not good with the political process. I was never really involved. One of the easiest things for me was joining Florida Freedom Keepers, because they follow the bills as they come up. They will alert you to different calls for action. Without them, I don't know. I just wouldn't know where to start, because that's just not my area. So if you're looking on ways to get involved, I definitely suggest joining Freedom Keepers. Many states have a Freedom Keeper chapter. Freedom Keepers United, I think, lists all of the different chapters, so you can go there. And this is not a plug, I love Florida Freedom Keepers, but I wouldn't know where to start. And I see a lot of the comments are saying, where do we go and how do we know what's going on? And for me, that was just the easiest. I could just go and figure out what's going on. So if that's where you want to be, you can always obviously follow us on Facebook. Sean posts a lot of different videos. Louis Leo is always doing different things with all the different laws, all of our civil liberties. So please, stay in touch with us. We're going to be doing, like we said, a town hall next week, and we appreciate everyone that has supported us so far. And we're just trying to do everything we can. So if there's any recommendations that you think that we could use to help us do this better, please let us know. Thank you for coming tonight.
Who's next? Me?
Go ahead, Louis. It's all you.
I don't have much else to say other than, I think everyone should always know their rights and assert them, because constitutional rights defense doesn't start in a courtroom, doesn't start with an attorney or, filing a lawsuit. It starts with someone who knows their rights, knows the law, and defends their rights. And you should never, waive your right without thinking it through. Learn the risk, not just the risk of a harmful pharmaceutical product, but the risk of waiving your rights. That includes your right to counsel, your right to a jury trial. There's so many rights. I encourage people to read the Bill of Rights, read the U.S. Bill of Rights, read your state constitution, get familiar with it, because that's the power. The power is in knowing the law and then applying it. And anyone who's confused or has any questions can always email me. You can also email info@floridacivilrights.org, and we'll certainly do our best to either help in any way we can, or at least point you in the right direction.
Wonderful, Louis. Thank you, and thank you everybody out there. I mean, you are one of the informed people. You've spent 2 hours of your evening with us. We greatly appreciate it, being part of this knowledge campaign and getting other people in the know. You're now more informed. You understand better what's out there, and hopefully you can sow the seeds of knowledge to others. So, thanks for being a part of this, being part of, what we're building, hopefully a better America, a more informed America. I fundamentally believe we should know these laws are out there, and it's very unfortunate these laws have been hidden. So it's time that we start spreading the words. And as Sophia said, there's a way to do that without being obnoxious, but just saying, hey, you fellow citizen, did you know this is the law? And the other person might say, cool, that's the law. Or they might say, oh my God, that's the law. But just being an informed citizen, right? We should all know what the laws are, and they shouldn't be hidden from us, and they shouldn't be put in obscurity. So sowing those seeds of knowledge. I hope some of you want to volunteer and get part of this movement and sow the seeds and get more people involved at the grassroots level, because we want to start fanning this knowledge out nationally. We want people to know what their state laws are. We want them to understand what the judges are saying in their states. We want them to understand their state constitutions, and that's going to require a coordinated effort among the states. And then as we start seeing stuff happening nationally, the more people we have in the know, the more people are informed, the more we can coordinate and really make a difference. And that's the goal here, is to have an informed population here in America, have people know what's happening, hold our government officials accountable, and get the outcomes that we want, right? I mean, get to a world where we can't have one group of people forcing other people to do things against their will. As I said, we've already done that in America. Let's not repeat our mistakes again and have all the layers of problems we had once before from that, because it's going to cause a layer of problems. Now's the time to get things right. We have a real opportunity. So I'm going to get to know some of you more, better, and work together and really make a difference for our future. Melissa?
Again, I just want to say thank you so much, Sean, Sophia, and Lewis, for your effort, for your time. You volunteer your hours, and you work on top of this, and you have a social life or family. So truly it is an honor to work with you, and we appreciate the hard work and effort that you give us. Like, I'm a hairstylist and a mom. Reading bills is something that always challenges me. So thank you so much, truly. This was great, and I can see a lot of the responses are really excited as well. Thank you all for being here. Your voice matters. Your activism matters. Where you are, you can be brand new to this movement, or you can be a decade in, but we love your activism. Florida Freedom Keepers offers multiple ways that you can join us. We have social media platforms. We have the website. You can also email at flfreedomkeepers@gmail.com. You can email us things to get involved. We have online platforms, offline platforms. Like Sophia mentioned, we have easy to use call to actions that you can get politically involved. We try to post political events because we truly do believe to make change is to vote the right people in, the right people that will be like-minded and that will be going to Tallahassee to be standing up for our individual liberties. So bills started getting put in July 1st here in Florida. Every state is different. In Florida, our session starts in March 2021. So be looking forward to that. Also, if you are from another state and you joined us from somewhere else, please find freedomkeepersunited.org, or you can find Freedom Keepers United on Instagram. You can follow them and find a state chapter, and you can follow that state chapter as well. We're represented in over 40 states, and we love to have you. I love Sean's vision of the future. I'm a daughter of the American Revolution, and my ancestors fought, bled, and died for this country to be free from a monarchy. And it's just so incredible to see that we live in the land of the free, and we need to maintain our rights. So knowing your rights and maintaining them. And again, thank you so much for being here. You can replay this video. You can share this video. We have links for volunteer work. There is a link that you can sign up if you're interested in volunteering. We hope you guys have a great night, and don't be afraid to speak out. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Have a wonderful night.